But good afternoon and welcome to the fourth annual Alfred A. Cave Lecture in Native American Studies. My name is Ken Sassman. I am C.C. Brown Professor of Florida Archaeology, Department of Anthropology, and the steward of American Indian and Indigenous Studies program, sponsored today's program with co-sponsorship by George A. Smathers Libraries. We are honored today to be joined by Professor Kathleen DuVal of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, whose lecture today draws from her latest book, Native Nations, to make the case that this 250-year-old nation we call the United States was hardly the first on this continent, and that its establishment and expansion did not eliminate the hundreds of native nations whose histories were ignored or contrived in support of American exceptionalism. We usually begin these events with a land acknowledgement statement, but this time with a twist, inspired in part by Professor DuVal's op-ed in the New York Times last year. It is true that land we occupy in Gainesville was home to Alachua Seminole and Potano to Mukwa. To these, we can add 14 millennia of indigenous history in the region, starting in the Ice Age when sea level was 80 meters below present level and the Florida Peninsula twice as wide as it is now. But missing in land acknowledgement statements about the place in which we find ourselves today is that land of 120 tribes west of the Mississippi River was expropriated and sold to endow the University of Florida as a land grant institution. We implore our leaders to acknowledge this act of dispossession, as did those of MIT, South Dakota State, and others, and to invest the derivatives of land grant funding in support of Indigenous studies at UF. I have it dead. Thank you. Still have that magic. Operating without state funding, American Indian and Indigenous Studies is a consortium with 21 UF faculty spread across 10 administrative units. It started in 2008 at the urging of undergraduate students of Native American ancestry who rightfully sought greater capacity for the study of Indigenous history and culture. With financial and moral support from diverse partners, the program has provided curriculum, scholarly programs, and public outreach since its inception 18 years ago. An endowment fund established in 2019 ensures that American Indians and Indigenous studies at UF will thrive in years to come. In memory of the illustrious career of historian and educator Alfred A. Cave, Mary Kozlowski, Professor Cave's wife, gifted funds to UF in support of Native American studies. We remain eternally grateful to Mary for her vision and generosity of spirit. In a career spanning over half a century, Alfred A. Cave contributed greatly to our understanding of the colonial history of Native America, particularly during the Jacksonian era, but also throughout prior centuries of warfare and conflict and ensuing decades of Native revitalization movements. Professor Cave taught at various universities after earning his PhD in history from UF in 1961. It was not long before he rose to the ranks of higher administration, first at the University of Utah and later the University of Toledo, where he served with distinction as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences from 1973 to 1990. He thereafter returned to full-time teaching and research until his retirement in 2007. Among the many awards acknowledging Professor Cave's career is the 2015 Distinguished Alumnus Award from his alma mater. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming to the University of Florida, Professor Kathleen DuVal.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you all for being here. Thanks to everybody who is part of getting me back here. It's really nice to be back in Gainesville. I'm going to start 250 years ago, 1776 or so, with a couple of maps. Not that. This. This is, these are both maps from about 1776 of different parts of the continent, one with a larger continental kind of sweep, the other a little closer to here. If you look at these maps, you can see what's kind of on the land. The biggest font is a colonial name. So here we see Georgia, we see Florida. Over there, that's a French map, so you can see Louisiana across the whole middle, and other sort of French words. So these are maps obviously made by Europeans. But now I just want to zoom in on these maps. This is the same map, and look at what's written kind of one font under. This is the same as the map on the, which way is that? The left. It's an uncolored version, but trust me, it's the same version. It's just a little easier to see. Even this European map maker noted that in actuality, on the ground, as opposed to those sort of bigger font labels of colonial claims, that who's there on the ground? It's actual native nations, native peoples. This is a French map, as I said, so some of the words you might need to say out loud to make them translate into and what they sound like to you, like Choctaws, for example, starts with a T, but they are the fairly familiar native nations that were around in 1776. There's actually a 1757 map, but the colored version was 1776, and are still around today for the most part. It isn't complete. As you can see, if we look back at the Florida one, most of what this map maker knows is actually inlets and rivers. There aren't even many peoples marked in many places. This map has a big place on the plains that says, right, ces contrées et les nations sauvages sont peu connues, not very well known. We know there are nations there, but they aren't very well known. The point of all this is that almost all of Native America was Native people's countries, right? Their own countries in 1776. And the other point is that Europeans knew it. Even on their maps, it recognizes that. Now, let me show a map from about 100 years later, 1876. And I thought this is the Florida one again, right? You can see some of it is just inlands and rivers, but some of it is marked with native nations, names of native towns and native nations. This is the 1876 map. On this map, things have really changed, right? The United States has gone from just hugging the Atlantic coast, 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, to being a nation from sea to shining sea. Florida has had time to enter the U.S., leave the U.S. again and join the Confederacy, and come back in by 1876. On this map, the only real sign of Native presence is Indian Territory, there in the middle where Oklahoma is today. Sometimes I imagine, what if we had a time machine? We could go back to 1776 or 1607 or 1492 and show them this map and say, Indigenous people of the Americas, make a plan, right? Because this is what's coming. Maybe if we go back far enough, we can keep it from happening. There were Native people in the late 18th century, the early 19th century, that imagined maybe not quite this much domination by this new United States, but knew there was a wave of population threatening them that they should do something about. The Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, were some of these people. They warned other Native people in the early 19th century, first of all, the U.S. is much more dangerous than you might think. Much more dangerous than threats that have come before. Next, that we need not just a military alliance against them, but something deeper, something more existential against this kind of threat. We need what Tecumseh would call one family or one people, not just a military alliance. And Tecumseh traveled with that message, with the message that, as he put it to the Osage west of the Mississippi in 1811, something like, brothers, we all belong to one family. We are all children of the Great Spirit. My people are brave and numerous, meaning the Shawnees, but the white people are too strong for them alone. If you do not unite with us, they will first destroy us, and then you will fall an easy prey to them. If we all unite, we will cause the rivers to stain the great waters with their blood. So we might say, looking back, or if we had that time machine, that Tecumseh was right, that maybe more people should have listened to him. But let me show you another map. Let me show you another map, a map from another 150 years later. If you're not keeping up on your math, that's today, basically. U.S. Census is not the perfect way to account people's tribal affiliations, for sure. But what this census map does show from the 2020 census is that Native people, Native Americans, are still here in the United States. There's still a large population and presence, not with the not to the percentages as we might have seen on that those earliest maps, but are certainly still here. Another way to sort of look at it, also imperfect, is reservations today. Reservation land still exists and is a prominent part of the landscape in many parts of the continent. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of loss since 1776. These maps do not look like the 1776 map that is covered in the names of native towns, native places, native nations. But that 1876 map did not tell the truth either, right? That almost complete erasure of native presence across almost all of the continent was not true in 1876 and is not true today. This afternoon, I want to talk to you about, first of all, why the message of Tecumseh did not particularly resonate in the era of the Revolution and right afterwards. And also why general Native reluctance in those years and ever since to see themselves as all one people, as Tecumseh would have had them be, is why we have these realities that still exist in 2026. The reality of over 600 federally and state recognized tribes still within the United States. And that number goes up to something like 1,300 tribes still in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And why we also have today, I think, a resurgence of sovereignty and renaissance in indigenous politics and art and language. Because there were other ways that the continent's future could have gone. And one of these many historical possibilities, go back and start moving forward in time, would have been that native nations would have ceased to exist as separate sovereignties. That we wouldn't today have Mohawks and Seminoles and Miccosukis and Chickasaws. Today that they would either have assimilated entirely into the white or black populations of the United States, or that there would have been just a generalized Native American minority and not separate nations today. More than 600 separate nations today as we have. My main point today is going to be that the men and women of Native nations in the generations during the Revolution and right after the Revolution and through to today made sure that that kind of future didn't come to pass. That the future we have today is like this and not either combination of all Native people into one or assimilation into non-Native populations. They made sure that they remained separate nations. Now, there are lots of parts of that story and lots of important people in it over the centuries. But today I'm going to focus on Tecumseh and that first generation of Native people facing the expansion of the United States, of the new United States. The story of Tecumseh is usually told these days as a sort of righteous challenge to the United States, a righteous challenge to expansion that failed because, well, the US was too powerful by the early 19th century. And perhaps because not enough Native people acted in a unified way, unified opposition to that United States. Now, according to this kind of thinking, and I think the way that Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa would have told the story, it was the failure of indigenous people to all work together, to become one. That is what accelerated land losses that would happen throughout the 19th century. But the Native people whom Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa tried to recruit tell us a different story. So let's start with their message, with the message that Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa tried to spread. Their father and their older brothers had died in the long war that Shawnees fought against Virginia and the United States that stretched from 1774 to 1795. And it was in the aftermath of all of that, after that long war against the British colonies and the United States was over, in the spring of 1805, that the younger brother had the vision that would direct his path and give him the name Tenskwatawa. Tenskwatawa means the open door, open to the message of the Great Spirit. In Tenskwatawa's vision, the Master of Life showed him a rich, fertile country, abounding in game, fish, pleasant hunting grounds, and fine cornfields, where the Shawnees, his people, could live if they returned to older ways of clothing and economics, if they gave up alcohol, if they gave up private property, if they gave up violence against other Native people. Tenskwatawa's vision appealed to many Shawnees. Their world had changed fast in the previous decades, and that change was hard to understand. In just the 30 years since Tenskwatawa had been born, hunting and trade had shrunk, the Shawnee economy had shrunk. Astounding numbers of illegal U.S. immigrants had moved into the Ohio Valley, where the Shawnees lived. And the U.S. military and its squatters had forced Shawnees off of part of their land. It was a shocking turn of events. The Shawnees, like maybe most people, saw themselves as the center of the universe, of the center of history. An earlier Shawnee speechmaker put it 2 years before Tenskwatawa's vision as, "The Master of Life made the Shawnees before any others of the human race, and gave them all the knowledge which he himself possessed." Indeed, that Shawnee explained, all the other red people are descended from the Shawnees, and the Shawnees for many ages continued to be masters of the continent, using the knowledge which they themselves had received. A little bit more modestly, perhaps, Shawnee George Bluejacket said in 1829, "We were a great people. Our men were great warriors. They fought many tribes and always beat them." So there were Shawnees who found comfort in Tenskwatawa's preaching. He told them the Master of Life had shown him that the game hadn't gone extinct as they were afraid it had. He said the deer are merely half a tree's length underground. If they did as the Master of Life said, he would turn the earth over and the deer would soon appear again. The Master of Life promised the prophet, "If you will do everything I tell you, I will turn over the land so that the white people are covered, and you alone shall possess the land." Now, Shawnees weren't the only ones wanting to overturn the past few decades of history. While the independence of the United States wouldn't reach the West and affect the peoples of the West, like Navajos, Kiowas, and Shoshone, for another couple of generations, things had changed pretty fast east of the Appalachians already. And by 1810, by 1810, 1 million people from the United States had crossed over the Appalachian Mountains and were living between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. There are about 100,000, maybe indigenous people living between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. And the change is overwhelming and shocking, right? People are looking urgently for new explanations and ways basically to make this change stop. Now, between the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes, where the Shawnees were, a large number of peoples were living in closer proximity than in the past, after some of them had moved there to get away from colonial-era warfare farther east. This slide is really just to show you, I don't expect you to make sense of it, but really much more to show you the density of native towns that are in the upper Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes by this period. There are various Anishinaabe peoples, Shawnees, Lenapes or Delawares, Miami, Illinois, Wendat, Seneca. And these resettlements had required a tremendous amount of diplomacy and continuing coordination among various newcomers and people who had long lived there. Frankly, the kind of intricate alliance building, getting to know one another and getting along that the United States did not do when it was coming to new places. In 1829, looking back, George Bluejacket recalled these native migrations that made this place a success. He said, north of the Great Sepe, the Great River, or the Ohio River, he said, here we were given much land by our brothers, the Wyandottes. We built many towns and lived in peace. But still, even though they're this densely settled on the land, with one, maybe a Shawnee town right next to an Anishinaabe town, they still remained in their separate identities, in their separate nations. Shawnees remain Shawnees. But with all this change and new pressure coming from the United States, Tenskwatawa's message resonated with many people there. In 1806, he and his followers had chosen a location on a northern tributary of the Ohio River on Greenville Creek, marked on here on this map as Greenville. And they built a new town there and invited converts to Tenskwatawa's preaching to come. They built a 5,000 square foot council house where Tenskwatawa preached and celebrants danced. As with any good sort of religious revival, some of the people who came to Greenville Creek then went home again to spread Tenskwatawa's message elsewhere. In May of 1807, an Ottawa man named the Trout was back home 400 miles north, speaking to an open council of men and women and children about Tenskwatawa's message. So listen here to how the Trout makes a broad message about multiple kinds of people. So he's channeling the Creator right here. So these are the words of the Creator coming out of the prophet, the Trout. My red children have become scattered and miserable. The solution was you are to have very little intercourse with the whites. The whites I placed on the other side of the Great Lake, and he means the Atlantic, right? The whites I placed on the other side of the Great Lake, that they might be a separate people. He says, my red children can play ball against one another, but you are never to go to war against each other, but to cultivate peace between your different tribes, that they may become one great people. Now, the idea of separate creations was not new in this period. There was an ongoing, so many prophets had preached that God at the beginning of time made Europeans and gave them Europe, made Africans and gave them Africa, made Americans, Native Americans, and gave them the Americas. And Europeans had screwed it all up, right, by stealing Africans from their place that God had given them and bringing them and themselves to the place that God had intended for Native Americans. So it's not that it may still be a controversial philosophy among Native Americans in the early 19th century, but it's not new. The great Ottawa leader Pontiac had preached separate creations 50 years earlier. And alliance building between tribes is not new either, right? It goes back, till the beginning of time, perhaps, right? Certainly thousands of years. In recent years, Shawnee leader Blackhoof and Miami leader Little Turtle, I'll talk about them more as we go, had been among many working to implement tighter forms of military and diplomatic alliance among their tribes, including agreements not to sell land without the agreement of all the tribes who live nearby in this crowded region. What was radical in 1807, what was radical about Tenskwatawa's preaching, was the Creator's wish that they all become one great people. Right? Not just a military alliance, not just a diplomatic alliance, but that all Native people are the same. You can hear how far Tenskwatawa had developed this idea by a speech he made the following year. He said, the religion which I have established for the last 3 years has been attended to by the different tribes in this part of the world. They were once different people. They are now but one. They are all determined to practice what I have communicated to them, that has come immediately from the Great Spirit to me. When Greenville Creek, the settlement proved to be too close to U.S. settlements, which were pushing into the region, Tenskwatawa moved his town to the Tippecanoe River on lands that the Miamis, one of the peoples in this region, the Miamis considered to be their own. Little Turtle complained. He said, this is Miami country. You can't just build a town on this without our permission. Tenskwatawa replied he would not change his plans. He would not move this town because my plans have been laid by all the Indians in America. By 1808, becoming and being one people was the message of Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh, who carried it far and wide. Their confidence in this idea that all Native people should be the same, that all Native people were the same, it did convince some people at the time. And it's kind of tantalized people ever since, right? That it might be true. Like there might be a path there that was the right one that they should have taken, right? But most people, most Native people at the time did not see the world Tenskwatawa's way. They did not agree that we are now but one. Which brings me to the Shawnee leader Blackhoof. Blackhoof rejected Tenskwatawa's message. His vision was to increase the centralization and the power of the Shawnee nation, right? To take Shawnee towns, which might not always act in a unified way, and unify them more, but to heighten the identity of Shawnees, not to make them like all other Native people. Since the 1790s, Blackhoof had been working to centralize Shawnee political leadership and to make some economic changes, both of which he believed would help the Shawnees to hold on to their land in the Ohio Valley. They started raising cattle and selling meat and dairy products, growing cash crops to sell. They built a grist mill and a sawmill. They also leased out tribal land. So not only did that bring in revenue, but when they leased land, it sort of embedded the fact that they owned that land in American courts, right? It looked more like land ownership to U.S. authorities, in theory at least. They invited a Quaker missionary in to help them break into new markets. Now, sometimes people look at the kinds of things that Blackhoof and other Shawnees were doing and call it assimilation. So say they're just trying to be like white people, right? They're just trying to be like people in the United States. But really, leaders like Blackhoof were trying to lead their nations into the 19th century future, right? As the Shawnee nation of the 19th century. Now, Tenskwatawa would not agree with my interpretation at all. He charged that Blackhoof and leaders like him abandoned the interests of their nations and sold all the Indians' land to the United States and requested the president to appoint masters over them. So Tenskwatawa means that Quaker missionary and U.S. officials as masters, right? Not the way Blackhoof sees it. Tenskwatawa went after these nationalizing, modernizing leaders like Blackhoof. And he also went after tribal religious leaders. Tenskwatawa led witch hunts against Delaware religious leaders who rejected his demand that they give up their own ceremonies and follow his religious interpretations. He was the prophet, right? He believed he was the voice of the Great Spirit. That's a big claim. And those who said otherwise, he said, were blasphemers. The brothers had particular trouble recruiting women. If you think about the things I've said about their message, it is almost all aimed at men, right? Be ready to fight. Monogamy, right? They thought they should move away from sort of certain types of households. But they needed women in these new settlements that they were building. Women were the farmers in Shawnee and other Ohio Valley people's cultures. They couldn't sustain a town without farmers, without women. And by asking people, by telling people that they needed to get rid of everything European, they created real problems for women who were fully Shawnee, fully Ottawa, fully other tribal nations of the Ohio Valley, but who over the generations before this, over more than a century, had incorporated European goods and sometimes people into their Shawnee way of life. So for one thing, he said no metal hoes, right? Basically, they would have to change the way they farmed, the way their mothers had farmed. They had long imported metal hoes for farming. In some versions, at least, Tenskwatawa told them, if you have any children who have any ancestry that is European or African, you have to send those children away. Family members. Not very appealing to mothers and grandmothers. So Prophetstown had trouble feeding itself. Then, right in the midst of this early stage of Tenskwatawa's evangelism in September of 1809, Little Turtle and other Miami, Delaware, and Potawatomi leaders signed the Treaty of Fort Wayne. In this treaty, they ceded over 3 million acres to the United States. People were frustrated, people were angry, and Tenskwatawa's message started to sound more appealing to some people. Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh agreed with them and threatened to kill the men who had signed the treaty. According to some accounts, Tecumseh declared that his followers will no longer suffer any village chiefs to manage the affairs of the Indians, and that I, Tecumseh, am authorized by all the tribes. I am the head of them all, and alone the acknowledged chief of all the Indians. Not true. It's not true, right? It wasn't just leaders like Black Hoof and Little Turtle who had no desire to yield their political authority to these brothers, right, with no standing. Even many ordinary Shawnees seem to have deduced from the trouble since the American Revolution that fighting wasn't the right answer, that it was that they would need, that these treaties were a way of giving up some land in order perhaps to preserve the rest. In fact, in the coming battles against the United States in 1812 and 1813 that Tecumseh will lead, there were Shawnees who fought and spied for the United States. And most Shawnees stayed out of the fighting completely. In fact, at this point, when Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa are preaching, more than half of Shawnees already had moved west of the Mississippi River to get away from U.S. expansion. I just want to pause here a moment before I sound too down on Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. And I want to say, I in no way think there was some correct way to hold back the United States in the 19th century. And also that one thing that they absolutely had in common with all of their opponents within Native communities was that none of them accepted white Americans' categorization of indigenous people as doomed or subordinate, right? They're all trying to figure out a Native future. None of them think that isn't something that will continue. But back to 1810. Tecumseh carried this vision of one people far beyond the Ohio Valley. William Henry Harrison marveled in 1811 that for 4 years, Tecumseh has been in constant motion. You see him today on the Wabash River, and in a short time, you hear of him on the shores of Lake Erie or Michigan, on the banks of the Mississippi. And wherever he goes, he makes an impression favorable to his purposes. And people did. They gathered and they listened. They were open to new ideas, right? But local history, conditions, needs, beliefs, and power structures affected how they responded. When people considered Tecumseh's universalist message, they thought locally. In the upper Mississippi River Valley, the Great Lakes, across the Mississippi River in Osage and Quapaw country, and also in the South, where he spoke to Chickasaws and Muskogee Creeks and Choctaws. Most often, the answer that Tecumseh got in all of these places was something like, oh yeah, we'd like to join at least the military part of what you're talking about. And we're going to come do that as soon as we finish this war we're already involved in, which was almost always against another Native nation, right? These wars among Native nations that were still continuing, these posed pretty big problems for Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. That meant that military effort that might be directed against the United States was instead being wasted in fighting one another. And then on a more philosophical level, this message completely undercut the idea of being all one people. As I said, there were Shawnees, many Shawnees living west of the Mississippi River by this point, and they must have driven Tecumseh crazy. They had moved over 600 miles to get away from the United States. They absolutely knew the danger and the power of the United States. But all of their military effort in the early 19th century was going against the Osage who claimed the lands that they had moved on to in the West. Potawatomi prophet Mampak converted to Tenskwatawa's movement, and he preached it to others. But he couldn't bring himself to include the Osage in all of the Native people that supposedly were the same kind of people. Right after he met with Tenskwatawa for the first time at Greenville Creek in the fall of 1807, Maine-Poc went back west with two objectives. First, to try to get more recruits to Tecumseh's mission, and second, to muster more fighters to fight against the Osage, right? Those things are completely in contradiction, right? Things are even a little muddy at Prophetstown. Some Kickapoos there in 1810 told a Frenchman that they knew that the prophet Tenskwatawa wanted them to fight somebody. They just weren't quite sure whether it was the United States or the Osage. Now, the Osage rivalry with the Potawatomis and the Sacs and various Illinois peoples was old. Maybe, at least according to some accounts, it went back as far as when the Osage themselves moved west, centuries earlier than this. These are not rivalries that people can easily toss aside. With the benefit of hindsight, of course, we can say Tecumseh was right. By the end of the 19th century, the United States would dominate the continent, and in the next century, arguably the world. Right? But for now, the Osage had the upper hand with outsiders. People feared them. The Osage shaved most of their heads and had about maybe a 5-inch sort of roach of hair coming up to make them like pointedly taller than most people, and then an eagle feather often on top of that. Thomas Jefferson, no shorty at 6'2", referred to the Osage as certainly the most gigantic men we have ever seen. You can almost hear his voice quavering, right? To the Osage, the Shawnees and the Delawares and the Cherokees who had moved west, fleeing U.S. expansion, they were the enemies, right? They were the ones taking Osage lands, not the United States. They were not going to see themselves as the same people. And many of the prophet's followers were more attracted by the military and political message of maybe joining together to fight against the United States. Then they were convinced that all Native people should be the same religiously or culturally. Part of Tenskwatawa's religious message was that his followers had to throw away their medicine bags and sacred songs, the parts of their former religion as they embraced his. And that was very controversial. A Sauk man named Wenabea told an American in the 1820s, "We always carry medicine bags about us. We take them when we go to war. We administer their contents to our relations when sick. They have been transmitted to us by our forefathers who received them at the hand of the great master of life himself." And yet, Wenabea recalled, so he's speaking in the 1820s, looking back at Tecumseh's message, he says, "Some of us did at one time, at the instigation of the Shawnee prophet, throw them away." Wenabea remembered that Tenskwatawa and his emissaries had told them that the medicine in our bags, which had been good in its time, had lost its power. And so many of our chiefs cast away their bags. But this proved to us the source of many heavy calamities. It brought on the death of all of those who parted with their bags. So Wenabea is looking back, their military defeats, right, that he's trying to explain, but he found his answers in the religious beliefs of his fathers, right, that giving those up when Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa said to had been the problem. Pretty much everybody agreed that the United States was a startling new force that required new solutions. And lots of people thought that Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh had an answer, but it wasn't the right one. Probably most disappointing to Tecumseh were the Muskogee Creeks, many of whom decided to follow the prophet's teachings, and they created the Red Stick movement. But rather than fight alongside Tecumseh and the British against the United States in the coming War of 1812, the Muskogee Creeks descended into civil war, the Red Stick War, fought among themselves, right? So civil war was, of course, the worst outcome, right? Exactly the opposite of what Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh had hoped. Okay, despite these setbacks, Tecumseh predicted that if war came, he said, all this island will rise as one man. They fought some skirmishes against U.S. settlers and U.S. troops. And then the United States declared war on Britain in 1812, and it seemed like the time to strike. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa declared war on the U.S. in June of 1812. They joined the British side in the War of 1812. And many people did ultimately choose to join Tecumseh's fight, but not necessarily as converts to their religious movement. Almost all of them seem to have been fighting to protect their families, their towns, their nations. Only maybe 40 or so Shawnee men would join. Many more Anishinaabe and Ho-Chunk and Kickapoo, other communities around, joined Tecumseh's force of about 2,000 men that defended the Canadian border in the fall of 1812. They pushed U.S. forces south back down to Detroit. Then they took Detroit, while the Potawatomi force took Chicago. But when U.S. ships defeated the British fleet defending Lake Erie in September of 1813, that cut off the supply line to Tecumseh's and the British troops in the West, and they had to retreat. Tecumseh's force had to retreat with the British Army back into Canada. At the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh was killed. And at the Treaty of Ghent ending the war, British negotiators proposed to the United States creating a permanent new independent multinational native nation between Canada and the United States. U.S. negotiators said absolutely not. One of the British negotiators wrote, "I had till I came here no idea of the fixed determination which prevails in the breast of every American to extirpate the Indians and appropriate their territory." So 250 years ago, 56 men representing 13 colonies declared the independence of a new republic. The creation of that United States in turn set in motion a great deal of history, to put it mildly, history that still shapes us today. But I think it's still important to remember that in 1776, this new United States shared the continent with hundreds of other independent democracies, consensus democracies for the most part, democracies that had been here a lot longer than the United States. They changed, of course, they changed over the millennia before that and over the 250 years since then, as all human societies do. But they're still here. And I think it's important that when we tell the history of the American Revolution, and telling it a lot in this year of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, that we tell it as an international war, that we include European empires like Spain and France, and that we include native nations as part of an international aspect to the war. Native nations as sovereign peoples fighting for their own interests and their own independence. And I think it's important that we not then end Native history there, that we don't take that 1876 map that I showed at face value. Native nations did not vanish. They did not assimilate into white America. They did not become a single Native American identity. And I think the roots of their national survivals lie in fighting and allying with European empires, the United States, and one another in a variety of ways, in many different and sometimes opposed ways. And they lie in the refusal to accept the view that all Native people are or should be the same.